Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, where he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning Jesus came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. When he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped Jesus, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Well, as Kim started to say, that was quite a storm we had Friday night, early Saturday morning. I think I woke up at, 3 or 4, whenever it was happening, listening to the wind howling. I'm not normally up at that time. I know some of you are. But the wind was howling. The rain was battering the roof, and then next thing it was battering the windows. The rain turned into little hail, and then bigger hail. Like I said, I normally sleep through those kinds of things, so this felt a little more intense than usual. And as I was laying there, not being able to fall back asleep, I began to wonder and think about whether everything outside was going to be okay. I thought, do we have any windows open? Is our car in the garage? I hope so. The other car's at the mechanic. I hope they're not getting hail. Are the kids' toys inside? The camper's outside. I put that tape on there to be a temporary patch. It's now permanent. I hope it holds. But then I thought, there's nothing I can do, or nothing I really want to do at that point, about any of those things right now. Whatever happens, happens. I'll just clean it up in the morning. Unless that big siren in the park starts to make noise, then we actually have to get up and do something. And if what that siren is signaling comes to fruition, then we have a little bit more to worry about. But for now, at least, I think things are going to be fine. We're usually fortunate enough to worry a little bit about these storms that we face, but not so much that we can't go back to sleep and just come out in the morning and pick up a few branches and go on with the day. At least that's my usual expectation. There are certainly times when those expectations, though, are met with even stronger storms and more disastrous outcomes, whether it be the weather around us or in the midst of our lives. And then for some, it begins to feel as if there is simply no relent from these storms that we face. It's probably why we like to say, when it rains, it pours. We've been seeing here lately a lot how Jesus' disciples have had their expectations challenged by Jesus. For many weeks in the Gospels that we've been hearing, we've heard this whole series of parables that were meant to take familiar images and stories and show us this new way of understanding what God is doing around us, shifting our expectations. Last week in worship, you heard the gospel story from Matthew of his telling of Jesus feeding the multitudes. As you heard, thousands of people followed Jesus out of their towns and met him along the shore in the middle of nowhere. And as evening came, his disciples came to Jesus and said that he should send them away before it gets dark and they get hungry, because we know how we are when we're hungry. Can you imagine thousands of people like us? But Jesus said, as you heard, no, you feed them. And they're like, well, all we've got is this food that will barely feed us, and were we supposed to bring you something for dinner? Sorry. This isn't enough. But as Jesus does, he blesses it, and the crowd ate their fill with leftovers to spare. The disciples weren't expecting that. Then today, we heard that after everyone ate on that seashore, Jesus first sends his disciples away. They get into a boat and begin to cross the sea. And then Jesus turns to this multitude of crowds, now with full bellies, and tells them to head back into their towns. I've always wondered why Jesus dismisses the disciples first. Does he go to the crowds and apologize for them being inhospitable? But finally, once everyone is gone, Jesus can finally get back to some alone time because he wants to pray and grieve. If you remember, Jesus had just recently learned about the death of John the Baptist. John was not only Jesus' messenger and preparer of the way, but also a beloved family member. And so when Jesus heard this news about John, we hear that he leaves everyone behind and takes this boat to a deserted place to be by himself. But that deserted place ends up being where this great and hungry crowd finds him before he gets that alone time. And so when the disciples and crowds are finally sent away, Jesus gets that opportunity to go up the mountain to be by himself and pray. It seems like he did get some alone time in this moment, but then we hear in the story that as Jesus is up on this mountainside, he's overlooking the sea, and he happens to see his disciples in their boat, and it's being battered by the winds and waves of a storm. So whether or not he had the sufficient alone time he wanted on that mountain, Jesus comes down and goes to meet the disciples. But instead of walking along the shore around the sea to meet them on the other side, like anyone else would do, he takes a shortcut straight across the lake. Not parting it like Moses did and walking across the sea floor, but instead walking right on top of the water. Every time I think about Jesus walking on the water, I forget about the storm. I have this beautiful picture of him majestically walking on top of this calm water on a sunny day. But I'm reminded in this story that as he's doing that, those waves were rocking and rolling around him. And that's where Jesus appears to come to his disciples, to comfort them and save them in the middle of this storm. Then comes another detail in this story that I always seem to overlook. The disciples were terrified, but not because of the storm, at least according to Matthew. He doesn't say so. But rather they were terrified because they saw someone walking toward them on top of the water. That's the first mention of them being afraid here. They knew that the sea that they were boating across was notorious for strong winds and waves. They expected to be in that kind of a journey, and they expected to be alone in that kind of journey, a potentially treacherous journey. But they knew they had hope that they would most likely emerge on the other side, possibly only slightly harmed. What they were not expecting was for Jesus to show up in the middle of it all, but yet that's exactly what he did. And in the midst of their terror and crying at seeing what they think is a ghost, he speaks to them and says, "Take heart, it's I. Do not be afraid." A more literal translation of that statement in the Bible might be of good courage, I am." And when we think of it that way, we remember back that this is the same phrase that God says to Moses way back at the burning bush when Moses asks God, "What is your name?" The people are going to want to know, what do I tell them? And what does God say to Moses in response? God says, I am. I am who I am. And then so as Jesus is standing in the midst of these crashing waters, he's telling his disciples that he comes in the name of God. It is I am. And at the end of this story, we hear that those in the boat worship Jesus, saying, truly you are the Son of God. And that's the first time in this entire gospel where human beings declare Jesus the Son of God. This event is a turning point for those disciples. But then, as always, there's Peter. Peter, who just doesn't believe it. When the disciples say it's a ghost, and Jesus says, no, hey, it's me. Peter says, well, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. If you've read any of the Gospels, you know that Jesus generally does not grant a lot of signs that the disciples ask for. But here Jesus says, all right, come on out. And Peter does. He walks on the water until the winds blow him about and remind him that he's walking on top of the water. At which point we hear he begins to sink. He calls out for help, but he's caught by Jesus and they return to the boat. You of little faith, why do you doubt? Jesus asks him. I think the natural assumption we have, at least that I have, is that the doubt Jesus was referring to was when Peter got scared and began to sink in the water. He doubts, he fears, he sinks. But if you look at this story, did you notice that Peter actually doubts twice in this story? Once as he tries to walk on the water himself, but also a little bit before that, when Jesus arrives and declares that it is he, Peter's response, Lord, if it is you, command me to come onto the water. Lord, I'm not sure about this. Give me a sign so that I can really believe. Jesus appears, he says, it's me. And Peter still doesn't believe. Does Peter not expect Jesus to show up in the midst of these storms and in times of need? Where does he expect God to be? Where do we expect God to be? We heard the same kind of expectation in our first reading with Elijah. Elijah was running and hiding. He had just proven to the people, the Israelites, the power of his God over the power of their god, Baal. And after all of that happened, Elijah rounded up all of their prophets, the prophets of Baal, and he kills them all. So he was running from their king, assuming that the king was mad about this. And he was probably maybe even hiding a little bit from God, thinking that even though he was zealous for the Lord, as he said, he was thinking that maybe God wouldn't be so pleased with all the killing. So in the midst of this cave where Elijah is hiding, God shows up, God speaks to him and says, go outside, for the Lord is about to pass by. And then we hear one of my favorite passages when it comes to how we are to listen for God's voice and presence. Because we expect God to show up in big and powerful experiences, right? A burning bush, the clouds on top of a mountain, kind of the way Elijah felt. And so he heard a great and powerful wind, but then he knew that God was not in the wind. And then he experienced that great and powerful earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. Then there was this great and powerful fire, but God was not in the fire. But then God does show up. Where? In the sound of sheer silence. Defying all expectations, God shows up in silence to speak words of life and hope. Defying all expectations, God shows up in the middle of a storm and reaches his hand out to us to save us and calm the seas around us. Defying all expectations, God is right there when those seas get rough and our fears and doubts consume us. Defying all expectations, we hear this promise that God is with us no matter what we face in our life. Amen.